right, so tonight I have Suzanne Simpson with me. Suzanne has a private practice. She is a therapist. You've been doing this a while. Tell us a little bit about your focus.
Yeah, I've been working with people for over 25 years, but I think during the course of that time, I've kind of figured out what I enjoy the most. And, working with couples is a great way to see, where people are struggling on the inside because it brings up a lot of issues that people don't know they have on the subconscious level. So I like to help them dig a little deeper to get to the root of what some of those belief patterns might be. I use a range of energy psychology methods that I learned through Anthony Robbins and just my own, exposure to different methods. And so I like to really get to the root of things and
Mm.
find ways to create more healthy interactions that aren't full of conflict.
Right, right, which is why we're here tonight, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, and I also have a private practice. I'm in Lone Tree. I work mainly with men and couples, so I thought it would be a good partnership for Suzanne and I to work together. I work with men, and men typically what I find is by the time they come into therapy, they have had an explosion or a blow up or an ultimatum in their life, either from the law with a DUI or something like that. Their wife is ready to head out the door, or something has happened in their career, either they're stuck or they have had something happen. So by the time guys come to see me, they are ready to make something happen. And I find that that's why I like working with guys. I also have my approach is pretty straightforward and no nonsense, and we really dig in really fast. And so it works because guys have had that ultimatum. They're ready to really dig in. So in a repeating pattern of conflict with our spouse that creates resentments, and the resentments are a lot like bricks. They build up over time. So if we have conflict and we aren't able to have conflict in a good way, instead of it coming out with some sort of resolution or the two partners feeling like they've been heard, they end up with a resentment. And the resentment is a lot like a brick. And that's why I've got a picture of a brick here. We carry bricks around with us, and they are a burden. So this next slide is the relationship cycle. Pretty straightforward. On one side is intimacy with safety and conflict on the other. And the main concept on this slide that I want to get across is intimacy. Sex is not intimacy. Sex can happen within intimacy or not, but it's not the same thing. For intimacy to happen, a couple of things need to happen. There needs to be safety. If I feel safe with my wife, then I feel safe to be vulnerable. And when she feels safe with me to be vulnerable, then we have a good chance of having intimacy. Intimacy is when two people are able to be vulnerable with each other because they feel safe. In the cycle, there are different phases. So if we come out of the intimacy side, we start on the intimacy side, you'll see that we have fun, comfort, boredom, tension. You can start to see it's starting to become a little darker and more negative. We get over to anxiety and then crisis, and then we have the conflict. And the conflict has its own circle because a lot of things can happen within the phase of conflict. We come out of conflict and compromise, negotiate, and then we go back into comfort and fun. Hopefully, if everything's going the way it should, we'll go back to the intimacy side. In a relationship that is growing, you'll have both intimacy and conflict. It takes both for the relationship to grow. Let me get okay. So imagine that you have a couple that's just come out of the intimacy side of their cycle, and they're in the car, and the husband says, "Honey, where do you want to go eat?" And maybe some of you have heard this story before. "Honey, where do you want to go eat?" She says, "I don't care, wherever you want to go." And he says, "Well, how about Mexican food?" And she says, "No, I don't really feel like Mexican food tonight." And he says, get this, he says, "I thought you didn't care where we ate." And she says, "What's your problem? What do you mean by that?" And he says, "I don't have a problem. What's your problem?" "Well, I don't have a problem. What's your..." And so they go, in 30 seconds, they go from having intimacy where they feel safe and they feel okay to be vulnerable with each other to conflict. It can happen just like that in 30 seconds. And sometimes it takes 3 days or 3 weeks, but it typically follows that relationship cycle. So you can see how quickly safety, intimacy, and having fun can spiral into conflict. So Suzanne, when a couple is, they're feeling intimacy, they feel safe to be vulnerable with each other, and they're having fun, and it gets comfortable. and that's a great thing, but not always a great thing, because what can happen then?
Right. I think of comfort as something that's easy, but really comfort can be too easy, and meaning that there's not enough discussion and working through things, and you've kind of reached a certain set point in the
Hmm.
relationship where you don't want to go past that, because this is where we've been all the time, this is what we're comfortable with, and so we don't want to go past that. But there's so much more perhaps that they could have in a relationship, but because it's familiar, perhaps like maybe a girl that grew up in a family where she didn't really have a voice, she never felt heard, or she always felt alone, let's say, then she might not want to be vulnerable in the relationship. She might fear that. He might fear that if he grew up that way as well. So some of these beliefs get formed in our upbringing. And what we believe is what we end up behaviorally acting out. So some of the beliefs might be, if I'm too vulnerable, my partner will leave me. I've heard that a lot. It's the fear of abandonment. Some people can even be more intimate before they get married, and then whoo, once they're married, then they know that they're really scared that perhaps they'll find out who I really am.
Mm.
Or they might have a belief, if I let go of control, I won't be able to trust anymore. Control is a big issue in relationships. Or I'm not smart enough for my partner to take me seriously, or he never listens to me, or she never understands my point of view. And this last one was more about business, which is more, if I don't get my business going, I'll feel like a failure. So those are just limiting beliefs that tend to really rule us. And if we don't know what those are, because they're on the subconscious level, then we don't know why we stay in this familiar pattern of being comfortable.
Right, right. We typically think guys won't have that issue, but it's actually, I'd say it's pretty equal with guys and women.
Hmm. Yeah, a
Yeah.
lot of times I'll ask people, what is uncomfortable if I was really to get close to my partner?
Mm.
And they might say, first off the bat, they'd say, oh, well, that's what I want.
Right,
But when they
right.
really think about it, then some of these areas that I've just discussed may be starting to come up, that they might fear that the person may not accept them if they share too much about themselves.
Right, right, right. Our next slide, we're talking about boredom. And how is it possible that if we're comfortable, how is it possible, Suzanne, that we could get bored?
Well, because we're not having enough interaction between each other. When couples tell me that they never have conflict, I kind of worry about that because that's how you really do get closer. And so
Mm,
I think the boredom sets in because they don't realize that they're really not engaging with the partner.
mm,
And so what has to happen is for them to raise their set point, meaning that they decide, I am going to trust this partner. I am going to spend more time in the marriage, in the relationship, being intimate. I am going to be vulnerable. And all of these things begin to raise that set point so that they're having more interaction, more conflict, more discussion about things. And that creates more stimulation rather than boredom.
right. Yeah, that's for sure. And uh, when we're bored, then we start to get a little snippy with each other, right?
Hmm.
And which means things get a little tense around the house. So say a little bit more, if you could, about tension.
Yeah, I think about tension is when people don't deal well with their emotions. One of the authors that I really like today has done a lot of research actually on vulnerability and shame, and she's speaking all over the country on this. But she says when we allow ourselves to feel pain, we also increase our capacity for passion and joy.
Mm,
Or if we numb out those painful feelings, we numb out the positive ones. So I think it's learning to express those emotions, or at least identify them, start to identify them within yourself.
right.
Because when I'm most distressed with my husband, it's usually because I'm distressed with something inside me. I've had a bad day, or, I'm feeling unworthy or lack of confidence with maybe something I had interacted with a person today, and then I'm sort of letting all that out. I'm regurgitating that out on my husband. So that is where I'm not dealing with my feelings
Mm,
effectively. And so
right,
I need to first kind of deal with my pain, and then I can deal with maybe some of the relationship issues.
right, right. What are some of the ways you see people become numb? How have you seen that?
Well, it's just they push their feelings down. They push a lot of their anger down,
Hmm.
and then it comes out maybe in sarcasm or contempt. Putting the person down, or maybe it comes out in a big way, a big explosion, because that's because they've trash compacted that anger for over a period of time, and then all of a sudden it just comes out in a big way.
Right.
I bet people on the call can relate to that. What do you think, Rick?
I think so. In fact, we might even have some experts. In fact, I've had a conversation with Thea about uh, some of the ways people will uh, numb themselves out is obviously with alcohol or
Oh,
food
sure.
or the way we treat our bodies or our behaviors. So a lot of the patterns that we'll see in relationships have a lot to do with how we numb ourselves out. So we may want to be close and have uh, be intimate and then have some mojo, right?
Hmm.
But instead, what we end up doing is we find ways to distance ourselves from our partner. So TV or finding busy things to do or staying late at work. I see that a lot with the guys that I work with.
Hmm.
Yeah,
No, absolutely. And that kind of leads into the next area,
right,
which
right.
is about anxiety. When we don't deal well with emotions, or we get kind of stuck in addictive behavior, which is what you're describing, we
Hmm.
get busy, we get pulled into our kids' drama, or we go out and drink too much. All of that can be because under the iceberg, you're getting to the next slide, has to
Yep.
do with, the anxiety is like an umbrella feeling. It's there to show us that there's something we're not dealing well with on the inside.
Hmm.
And I call these the silent saboteurs, because I feel like we're not always aware of what they are, but we know that we're using a substance or we're dealing with addiction as a way to deal with that
Right.
anxiety. And what they are, typically, you see some consistency there with some of these emotions. Some people have shame. Shame is more about, I'm not worthy enough. I'm
Hmm.
inherently flawed in some way. And so I don't want to feel that, and therefore it's pushed down. We may have fear, which most people have that from time to time, or
Hmm.
mistrust. Mistrust is really common with partnership, with a marriage partner. Maybe I don't trust him. Maybe he's on the internet too much, or, listening to, um, oh, I don't know, music that's inappropriate or whatever. It's just that mistrust that goes on. How they're spending money is what I hear a lot of,
Ah,
mistrust about. Yeah. And then
right.
guilt. Guilt is more something that you've done, an action that you've done that you feel bad about. Maybe you haven't told your partner about it. Or maybe it's just these can be early childhood feelings as well.
Right.
And then, of course, we have anger. And the biggie is lack of forgiveness. I'm just totally convinced that when people don't forgive, many times it's forgiving themselves. But, that really does wear on the relationship. Would you agree?
Absolutely. In fact, and each one of these we could drill down into and spend an hour webinar on each one of these. One that I see a lot of in conflict is shame, which shows up as defensiveness in when a couple is arguing. Uh, uh, and a lot of times a partner will find that trigger. They'll say that one thing that they know will trigger their partner into a shame spiral, and then they know the argument's over, or it'll escalate to the next level, and which is not good. So the question I typically will ask a couple is, what do you hope to get out of saying what you just said? I'll interrupt them in the middle of their conflict and ask them, what were you hoping to get out of that? And then they will have told me a story before, and I can say, and I'll ask them, has that worked before? And it's, well, no, I never get what I want out of this by bringing up shame or any of these.
Mm-hmm.
Now you go into a little more detail in your book. You have an ebook that's available.
I do.
Uh, yep, 8 strategies to stop self-sabotage. Is that what you mean by self-sabotage? Is these different aspects? These
Oh, yeah,
shame, fear?
absolutely. I think people aren't aware that it's it's who they are that gets in their own way. It's the sum total of your beliefs and your values and how these emotions that we've been talking about. A lot
Mm-hmm.
of that is at the undercurrent of our behavior. So that's what creates the self-sabotage. And if we don't get to that, then we might be really feeling a cycle of boredom, because we're just rehashing things over and over and we're never getting to the root of it.
Right, right, right. That's great. Uh, so let's keep going here because this is good stuff. We're now at the phase of the cycle. We've had comfort, boredom, tension, anxiety, and in an environment of anxiety, it's ripe for a conflict. And it could be something as simple as where are we going to eat tonight to I can't believe that you did that. You're just like your mother, and that seems to be the nail in the coffin for a lot of people. Um, so here's what I want to say about conflict is when it happens in a way that it's a pattern and it continues and conflict creates resentments, we end up with this cycle that I have on the slide where it ends up on the right side of the cycle most of the time. So comfort, fun, safety, and intimacy basically goes away. And that's when couples will come to see someone like Suzanne and me. Uh, because they end up with just tension, anxiety, lots of crises, lots of conflict, or they're just basically stonewalling each other and creating that distance, numbing themselves out so they don't have the conflict. And either way, nothing's getting resolved, and they just end up in this spiral of boredom, tension, conflict. And that's a very unfortunate thing. And so let's talk, Suzanne, a little bit about how to do conflict in a way that's better. And I'll start it off. I want to talk a little bit about feelings. So let me lay the groundwork here. So feelings are something that we experience. A lot of us haven't really been taught what feelings are, and we make the assumption that if I'm angry, I'm angry. It's who I am. I hear guys say, "Well, I don't know. I have anger management problems, and I'm just angry all the time." And so I tell them what I'm getting ready to tell you. Feelings are a lot like the weather. The weather, we experience it, we'll get rained on. Oh, I'm being rained on. Oh, okay. And then, here in Colorado, an hour later, it stops raining and the sun comes out. Oh, there's the sun. The weather is always happening and we experience it, but it's always changing too. So I'll have a feeling of anger and then it goes away and it's replaced by happiness or it's replaced by sadness and it's continually happening. But here's the key, here's the secret sauce. It is always happening in my head. These are my feelings. So I'm the gatekeeper. I'm the owner of the feelings. And when I take ownership for my own feelings, then I can start to make change. And that's the key. That's sort of that's the baseline for making change in how you do conflict. So if I'm angry and I go into a conflict with a harsh startup, let's say, I can't believe you said that. You're just like your mother, right? I'm going to pull that one out. Then it's not going to go well because typically conflict, the way it starts is the way it ends. And so if you start with a harsh startup, that's probably how it's going to end. So own the feelings, own your feelings. They are yours and you do have a choice. If a guy parks sideways and takes up 2 parking spaces and I could say to myself, that guy made me angry. But the feelings are mine, and that's not true. He didn't make me angry. I'm choosing to be angry. Let's talk a little bit about working through the conflict. So some key skills for collaborating. Suzanne, you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah, I think, most couples don't really know how to listen correctly,
Mm,
because they're real quick to want to point the finger and say, well, you did this or you did that, or and they haven't even heard what the person was upset about or how they felt. So check to see if you've heard it correctly. I have people do reflective listening many times where they just listen to the person and they reflect back what they heard the person feel. Like, well, I hear that you're really angry about the situation that happened at work. Tell me a little more about that.
hmm
So you prompt them to really engage in what's going on, or maybe I hear that you're upset because I haven't done my chores this week, which typical maybe. So, tell me how you feel when that happens. I mean, that's hard to do, but if couples can start doing that, it goes a long way with women, especially because then they feel like, wow, I've been hurt. And then, the other thing is don't use the yes buts, since it doesn't give the person a comfort level that you're listening, because you're ready to defend yourself. Yes, yes, but let me tell you why I didn't do the trash this week. I got caught up at work, and I have had a busy week, and
Right.
I'm very depressed about this client that I have, and I feel like you don't understand anything about what I'm going through.
But
Have you heard this one before? And
yeah,
then all of a sudden the other person is going, um, okay, so originally I was talking about the trash, and now we're talking about your feeling. So, you've got to engage that person to talk about what's really going on with them and listen and reflect back what you've heard them say.
but if I'm not interrupting and saying but, then how can I fix her?
Well,
Because
that's the problem.
that's my job,
Because
right? Is to fix her
guys
problems.
are ready to step in and say, "Let me fix this problem.
Right.
Let's see how we can solve it immediately." And if you've listened to John Gray on the differences between men and women, he'll say that women have this tremendous need to be just listened to, and
Hmm.
men really want to fix. So I think it's a problem, but the statistics show that 70% of people's conflicts can be solved if you just understand and you listen and you hear what's happening with the person, and
Yep.
giving each person equal airtime, because
Right.
a lot of times one party gets all the airtime and the other party hasn't said a word.
Right. Right. I do tell couples when I'm working on them around their communication, guys will say that. They'll say, well, she's talking to me because she wants me to do something about this or make something happen here. And I have to remind them a few times that the fix is the listening. Being heard is the fix. And it takes a while for that to sink in, but once it does, they'll come back and uh, they'll say, wow, it's so much easier to do it this way because I don't have to fix anything. I just listen. Are you sure that's all there is I mean, I hear different comments like that. Are you sure that's all there is? And I've had a client just the other week say, I've tried this at work with my employees. I have employees, they'll come in and they'll complain about something and it's not working or whatever. And I won't really say anything. I won't try and fix it. And then I've learned with my employees even that just hearing them and letting them know that I've heard them, they already had the answer when they came in. They just wanted to hear, they just wanted to be heard, and they wanted their boss to hear them. So it's absolutely true what you're saying.
Hmm.
Um, so let's talk a little bit more about soliciting input. So what do you mean by that?
Well, I think sometimes we have to find out what's in the head of the other person, because we can't read their mind. So how do you think things are going in our relationship? Do you feel like there's some areas that we could grow in, or help me understand? Asking how, or what do you think are the best ways for us to increase our intimacy in the relationship? Just solicit that. I think people don't realize that questions are very important. The questions we ask ourselves are important, but especially the questions we ask others.
Mhm.
And then if you're asking why questions, why do you always do this? That's no, that won't work, because the brain can't go anywhere with that. It's like, oh, I'm in a dead end all of a sudden. Why do I always do this? Your brain's looking for reasons. Or,
Mhm.
but what about how could you find ways to improve the way we do this? That gives the brain options. So I would encourage that. And what are ways to solve the problem? Now, you mentioned that we listen, and we do listen to understand, but there are times when we have to solve a problem or we have to compromise.
Right,
Yeah.
right. I would say the why question, why did you do that? That is a fixer kind of question. It comes from both men and women. And Naomi, I got your message. Here's Naomi's response. We are cracking up. This has been a discussion for us in the past, working on it on both sides. Naomi, tends to be the fixer most of the time. Interesting.
Yep. It
That's
can go
because
either way.
that's because Ron's got it all figured out. Um, So, what are some of the ways we could solve this problem? When I heard about this, so um, I'm going down to that third section on the slide there. What are some ways we can solve this problem? Those are great questions. Uh, what is it about feelings? Is it important to hear your partner uh, find out what their feeling is?
You asking me?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, first off, when you're soliciting more information, you're trying to find out what's at the root. What is really the problem here? And
Right.
that's where the guy can be using his fixing mentality, or at least to try to figure it out. Well, what are you really feeling? And allowing that person to express it and to say, yeah, I am upset about this, and I've been upset about it for some time, and how can we work towards some solution here?
Yeah. Right. Right. That's great. Um, so I'm going to go a little bit further. Collaborative win-wins. So talk solution rather than problem. What do you mean?
Yeah, well, that's what I was just saying. I think so much of the couples I've heard, they dwell on the problem and they stay immersed in the problem.
Hmm.
The problem is we're having, let's see, a disagreement over how we should raise our kids, or we're having disagreement about how we spend our money, which
Mm-hmm.
typically can happen. Okay, so they stay in all the anguish about the problem with the money and how they don't have enough money, or the wife spends it too frivolously, or the husband doesn't save like he should. So, there's all those kind of reasons. So they're not really talking, well, what are ways that we could work on this?
Right.
And then avoiding any hint of blame, judgment, or criticism.
Oh my gosh, I got to interrupt you right there. So I had a couple, they were talking about the house that they bought. He apparently bought the house without consulting her,
Whoa,
which, yeah, right, right, right,
that's a
right.
biggie.
You bought this house, blah blah blah, and judgments. And so I talk a lot with couples about the judgment loop, and this is what I call it, because judgments are a way. So I'll give you an example. Uh, you never consult me when it comes to a big decision, especially around money. You don't think I know what I'm doing with money, so you just go ahead and make decisions. And I mean, it goes on, and you're just like your dad and your brother, and I mean, we bring in the whole family. So it's those judgments go on, and I have found that people use those judgments. You should. Why can't you? You're just like. I found that those accusations, those judgments, are usually right or wrong type of statements, and they are there to get the other person to hear the speaker. And what I mean by that, by when we feel heard, genuinely heard, what we're really wanting is for somebody to acknowledge that um, I get that you're angry, and I hear that you feel like I never consult you, especially around money, and it makes you feel, I don't know, insecure. And and so the judgments are there to help try and get that person to feel heard, but they actually do just the opposite because the listener gets defensive and they'll either stonewall and walk away or shut down, or they'll fight it and they'll become more aggressive, and that's what escalates the conflict. Something you should, you never, you make me feel. There's a biggie. You make me feel. That's why I mentioned the feelings earlier. We we are the gatekeepers for our own feelings. So,
Mhm. Well, I
uh,
think the problem with those statements is that
hmm
it's all pointing the finger. You should, you never. And there's some very absolute words in those statements, like you never, or
yep.
it's probably that you don't never, I mean, that you aren't always that way. But
hmm
in fact, I was working with a couple last week, and they said um, that they were constantly saying, you never do this, you never do that. So I told them for 1 week they couldn't say never, and then after we talked about that, they said never about 4 or 5 times. They caught themselves. So,
Yep. Yeah.
it's pointing the finger. It's not saying, I feel this way, or I need this, or I'm angry, or whatever.
hmm
When you get those I statements in, it gets it back to you.
Right.
And it
Right.
doesn't put the person on the defense. Um, and you can see that, maybe there's an issue that's mutually that you're both dealing with and trying to solve. And the biggest thing I think is to not opt for power over, but to have power with. You
Right.
want to collaborate. You want to get the person to work with you. And if you're in a company, and you're trying to power over everybody, you're not going to get people to work with you.
Hmm.
So why would you do that at home?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Um, and it can go really deep with this. Some people have, of all these issues that we brought up, I've noticed that people have their favorites. I see a lot where couples, uh, one person in the couple will get on a roll, and I'll say, why do you go into this judgment loop and you keep going there? Or what is it about that judgment loop? And she says, well, I'm on a roll, and if I get it all out, then he'll understand me. So I want to bring up that Suzanne and I are offering free discovery sessions if you know anybody who could use uh, some counseling or they're thinking about it. This is a great way to find out if Suzanne or I might be a good fit for you. So we have our email addresses here. And what we'd like to offer is if you'll email us or you'll have a friend or family member email us and let us know that they're interested, we'll call in the next 24 hours, set up an appointment. It's free. It's a $100 value, but we're going to offer it here on this webinar for free. So Suzanne, working through conflict. We have uh, we do conflict in different ways, don't we? Because we have different personalities,
Hmm.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I find that people pleasers kind of have the hardest time because they always want harmony. And so they're either avoiding discussing things or they're trying to rescue the partner all the time and not really dealing with the conflict. They're either, being the nice guy or the nice girl all the time and looking like everything is fine, but inside they're pretty angry.
So I was going to say that's a really nice way to say it, people pleaser, because I think that's what I am. But I'm more like an avoider or a diplomat. In my family growing up, I was the diplomatic kid who tried to bring everyone together. So uh, is that a people pleaser?
I think it is more of a people pleaser. Yeah.
Yeah,
Were you the youngest in your family?
I was.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that common
Usually
for?
that's common.
Uh,
They call them the either the hero or the one that kind of tries to pull the family harmoniously together.
ah,
And they kind
right.
of carry they get humorous sometimes as a way to deflect
Hmm.
from some of the dis disharmony.
Yeah, right,
Yeah. So
right.
that could be, I was the youngest, but I was quite a bit younger, so I was kind of like an only child. And
Oh, I see.
yeah.
Right, right,
The controller wants to have the upper hand, and they are the ones that don't give the other party space to share what their reality is, what they really are experiencing. I find this happens with my husband sometimes, and it's hard being married to a therapist sometimes. But I tell him, I say, I have to have my own opinion and reality about what I'm sharing. So that's important. I think the other person is kind of boundaryless sometimes, where they don't have clear ways of expressing what they need and what they want, and they sort of just let people either be a doormat or they never discuss, well, let's get back together at a time when we can really talk through this, because right now I'm fuming.
right,
So maybe they need to establish some boundaries and say,
right.
it's not a good time, but let's get back at 7 o'clock and talk about this, and that way we can work on it. And then
That that
the
takes a lot of self-awareness to be able to do that too. To be able to do
Yeah, it
that.
takes some discipline too, because
Hmm.
I think if you're fuming and you've got all this anger, it's just oozing out, then it's really difficult to try to pull back and say, let's talk about this a little bit later,
Right,
because all that anger is just going to spew out on the person, and they're not going to feel like you've been able to work on it.
right, right, right. And that last one, avoiders.
Yeah, that's absolutely the biggest problem because you have nothing to work with. They've avoided dealing with any conflict, so they're often in another room and totally withdrawing from you. Yeah.
Right,
So
right,
I think
right.
it would be good to hear from each person if they can identify where they might fall into some of these patterns.
Yeah. If you're up for it, over on the right side, you can put a chat in there. And what is your favorite style of conflict based on your personality? How do you like to fight? Um, let's see. Let me get back here. Well, okay. So our next slide gets into some of our identities and how we can be vulnerable during conflict. What happens uh, with our vulnerable identities?
Well, I think there's the denial aspect, which means that they don't want to see themselves in any poor light or anything that's not positive identity around who they are and their self-concept. So to have negative feedback is not pleasant. So they just stuff it all and basically look good and don't deal with it.
Right,
And
right.
they're usually the ones that say, you're just like your mother. Or the exaggeration where we let other people's feedback define who we are. We tell ourselves, I can never do anything right. I found
Hmm.
myself doing that. I just can't ever quite get it right.
Do you see that a lot? That seems like something, and I don't want to be sexist here because men definitely have that. But I would think women have that as well. Do you see that a
I
lot?
think so. Yeah, I think
Yeah.
women typically have more of that nature of wanting to to please and do everything right. And I know it works that way in my marriage.
Ah,
So
right.
and one thing too, we've talked about how men and women deal with these conflicts differently. And I think women, after they've tried to work on the relationship for a while
Hmm.
and they've
Yeah,
not gotten very far, they really get to the point of no return.
they're done. They're done.
They're done. And
Yeah,
they're coming to the husband saying, I think we need to separate or whatever. And then the husband's like, what? What
yeah.
happened? You
The
know?
big surprise. Right, right.
Yeah. If you never saw conflict worked through, and
Hmm.
many of us didn't have parents that did that well.
Right,
They either, in my parent generation, they didn't do much at all. They just sort of hid, but
right.
now parents, I think, are more open with the conflict. But it just seems like if we didn't get those tools early on, then, it's common. So don't blame yourself, but realize that you've got some work to do on, kind of working through things and feeling like, oh, I am able to express how I really feel.
Yeah, right. I would imagine the kind of partner we have, their vulnerable identity also
Mhm.
triggers ours.
Exactly. I
Yeah.
found that, it's interesting when I got married, I married very late, first
Hmm.
time. And I was a nice I'm a therapist and I'm really nice, I'm a really nice girl. When I got married, I got so angry I couldn't believe it, because of some images that I had built up over what a husband should be for me. That he needs to be this way, and I spent years dreaming about what the husband should be like.
Right.
So I think for me, what helped our marriage was my husband has this belief that feelings are just God given, that if you have them, let's get them out, let's talk, let's
Mm.
express them rather than hold them. And so it helped me because even though I think I was inappropriate in some ways with my anger, at least for the first time in my life, I had permission to express them because I certainly didn't in my family background.
Right, right. Okay, so we've moved all the way through conflict, and once we've done that, if I were to draw another line, once we learn how to do conflict in a good way, I would draw a line on this cycle that's the opposite of this. I can't get there from here. This one right here, you see how the line goes down the middle and heads back to conflict? What we want to happen is to spend more time on the intimacy side. So we have comfort, fun, safety, intimacy, and then we have more comfort and fun. It gets a little boring. Maybe there's some tension, maybe even a crisis and a little conflict. But then we head right back over to comfort and fun, and that's how we end up with more intimacy, more mojo, right? Uh, all right. So if anyone has any questions, I'd love to hear them. You've got a couple of therapists on here for free, which is uh, huge. Just take advantage of it. And tell your friends, tell your family, and thank you for taking time to attend. And we'll talk to you soon. Take care.
Bye bye.